I handed the tea to my daughter-in-law, and less than a minute later, she collapsed in front of me. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching the steam still curl from the rim of the porcelain cup as if nothing had happened. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended in time, like the world itself was waiting to see what I would do next. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old and I have lived in the same house in Cedar Grove, Illinois for over 35 years. It's the kind of place where the floors creak in familiar ways and every window holds a memory. After my husband passed 3 winters ago, the silence became heavier, but I learned to carry it. What I didn't expect was how quickly silence could turn into something else entirely. 24 hours before that moment, my son Daniel had called me. His voice sounded different, softer, warmer, almost like when he was a boy asking if he could stay up past his bedtime. "Mom, I'm coming by tomorrow," he said. "I've got something special for you." It had been weeks since I'd last seen him, so I said yes without hesitation. That's what mothers do. We don't question kindness when it finally arrives. The next afternoon, he showed up with a neatly wrapped box and that same careful smile. Behind him stood his wife, Chloe, perfectly composed as always, her blonde hair pinned just right, her eyes scanning the room like she was taking inventory. "We brought you something to help you relax," Daniel said, placing the box on my kitchen counter. Inside was a small tin labeled Herbal blend, the kind you'd find in upscale grocery stores, promising calm and better sleep. "You've been stressed, Mom," he added, avoiding my eyes just long enough for me to notice. I thanked him, of course. I even smiled, but something in the air felt off. Maybe it was the way Chloe leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me too closely. Or the way Daniel insisted on making the tea himself, measuring each spoonful with unusual precision. "You should drink it all tonight," he said, setting the cup in front of me. "It works best that way." I remember wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic, feeling the heat seep into my skin. The scent was unfamiliar, earthy, slightly bitter, but not unpleasant. I lifted the cup slightly, just enough to see the reflection of their faces in the surface. They were both watching me. Not casually, not lovingly, waiting. That's when something inside me shifted. It wasn't fear. It was clarity, a quiet, steady understanding that settled deeper than panic ever could. I set the cup back down gently, my fingers no longer trembling. "You know," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "this smells wonderful." Chloe smiled at that just a little too quickly, and in that moment I knew. Whatever they had planned, it wasn't meant for her. But it would be. I did not drink it. Instead, I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then I reached for another cup from the cabinet, the one I used when guests came over, and placed it beside the first without saying a word. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table, a habit he had never quite grown out of since childhood. Chloe, however, remained still, her gaze flicking between the 2 cups as if trying to calculate something that had suddenly become uncertain. I picked up the teapot slowly, deliberately, and poured a second serving, the liquid moving in a thin, steady stream, filling the room with that same earthy scent. "We should all try it," I said gently, as if the idea had just occurred to me. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words never forming. Chloe smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Oh, I am fine," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. I nodded as if I understood, then slid the second cup a few inches closer to her. "Nonsense," I replied softly. "You brought it. It would be rude not to share." The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second marking the space between what was said and what was meant. Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time that afternoon there was something else in his expression. Not warmth, not concern, something closer to hesitation. "Mom, it is really meant for you," he said, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. I met his gaze without blinking. "Then I insist," I said. "You always taught me that good things are better when shared." That was not true, of course. I had been the one who taught him that back when he was small and believed everything I said without question. The memory passed through me like a shadow, gone as quickly as it came. Chloe reached for the cup then, her movements careful, almost too careful, as if she were stepping into something she did not fully understand. Her fingers wrapped around the porcelain, and for a brief moment she hesitated. I watched her closely, noting the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes flicked toward Daniel as if seeking reassurance. He gave none. He simply sat there, silent, his hands now folded tightly in front of him. That was when I knew I had been right. Not because of what they said, but because of what they did not say. Chloe lifted the cup and took a small sip, barely more than a taste, and set it back down with a faint clink against the table. "It is strong," she said, her voice thinner now, less certain. I nodded again, as if we were discussing nothing more than flavor. "It is supposed to be," I replied. The room seemed to grow smaller after that, the air heavier, pressing in from all sides. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires humming against the pavement, a normal sound in an increasingly unnatural moment. Chloe adjusted her posture, then again, her hand drifting briefly to her chest before falling back to her lap. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her now, his earlier composure beginning to crack. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, controlled but no longer steady. She nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, of course," she said, though her words seemed to lag behind her breath. I remained where I was, my hands resting calmly on the table, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged. I did not feel panic. I did not feel guilt. What I felt was something far quieter, far colder. Understanding. Because in that moment, as the truth settled into the space between us, I realized something that neither of them had considered. They thought I would not notice. They thought I would trust without question. They thought I would drink without thinking. But they forgot one simple thing. I had spent a lifetime raising a son, learning every shift in his voice, every flicker in his eyes. And now, sitting across from him, watching everything unravel piece by piece, I understood exactly how far he had gone, and how much further he might have been willing to go. Chloe tried to steady herself, but the effort showed in the smallest ways, in the way her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the table, in the way her shoulders rose and fell just a little too quickly with each breath. Daniel stood up halfway, then sat back down again, as if he could not decide which version of himself he was supposed to be in that moment. "Maybe you should lie down," he said, his voice thinner now, stripped of the calm tone he had practiced earlier. Chloe did not answer right away. She blinked slowly, her eyes unfocused for just a second too long before she forced a small smile. "It is just a little dizzy," she said. "Probably nothing." I watched them both without moving, without offering comfort, without stepping in to fix what was unfolding in front of me. That used to be my role. For years I had been the one who smoothed things over, who filled the silence, who made sure no one felt uncomfortable at my table. But something had changed, not just in them but in me. Daniel reached for his phone, his hand trembling just enough to betray him. He glanced at Chloe, then at me, then back at the screen as if he were searching for instructions that were not there. "Mom," he said quietly, "what exactly did you do?" I tilted my head slightly, considering the question as if it deserved careful thought. "I poured tea," I replied. "The same tea you brought me." He shook his head, frustration breaking through the thin layer of control he had left. "That is not what I mean," he said, his voice rising just enough to echo against the kitchen walls. Chloe shifted again, this time more abruptly, her chair scraping lightly against the floor. She pressed her lips together, her eyes darting toward the sink, the counter, anywhere but the two of us. "Daniel," she whispered, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Not confidence. Not calculation. Something closer to fear. He turned to her immediately, kneeling beside her chair. His focus completely shifted. Hey, it is okay," he said, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. I remained where I was, my hands still folded neatly on the table, my posture unchanged. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking each second with quiet precision. "You should not have rushed," I said calmly. Daniel looked up at me sharply. "What does that mean?" he demanded. I met his gaze without hesitation. "It means," I said slowly, "that patience has always been your weakness." The words landed heavier than I intended, or perhaps exactly as heavy as they needed to be. His expression shifted, confusion mixing with something else, something deeper. Recognition. because somewhere beneath the panic, beneath the urgency of the moment, he understood what I was really saying. This was not about the tea. This was about everything that had led to this point. Chloe let out a slow breath, her composure slipping further as she leaned back in her chair, her head tilting slightly as if the room had begun to move around her. Daniel stood again, pacing once, twice, his steps uneven, his thoughts racing faster than he could contain them. "We need to get help," he said, though he did not move toward the door. He did not reach for his keys. He did not make a call. Instead, he looked at me again, searching, accusing, pleading all at once. "What was in that cup?" he asked. I allowed a small pause before answering, just long enough for the question to settle between us. "That depends," I said quietly. "What did you expect to happen?" The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had not been said, everything that had been planned, everything that had almost happened. Daniel stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the realization dawning in slow, painful increments. Chloe closed her eyes briefly, her breathing uneven now, her earlier confidence completely gone. And in that moment, as the truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting to be spoken, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had not just underestimated me. They had forgotten who I was before I became the quiet, accommodating woman they thought they could outmaneuver. And now, sitting across from them, watching the careful illusion they had built begin to crack, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by fear or guilt or habit. It would be decided by me. Daniel did not answer my question right away, and that silence told me more than any explanation ever could. He looked at Chloe, then back at me, his eyes searching for something familiar, something safe but finding nothing. The distance between us, measured in just a few feet across the kitchen table, suddenly felt wider than it had in years. "We were just trying to help," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction, like a line he had rehearsed without fully believing in it. I let out a slow breath, not out of frustration but out of clarity. "Help me," I repeated softly, as if testing the shape of the idea. Chloe shifted again, her composure continuing to unravel in small, visible ways. She straightened in her chair, then leaned forward, then back again, as if her body could not decide where it belonged. "You have been alone," she said, her voice quieter now, more careful. "This house is too much for you. We thought maybe it would be better if things changed." I studied her face, the polished expression now cracked just enough to reveal what had always been underneath. Calculation. Always calculation. "Changed how?" I asked. Daniel stepped in before she could answer. "We talked about maybe selling the house," he said quickly. "Getting you somewhere smaller, easier to manage, somewhere safer." The word lingered in the air, heavier than the rest. Safer. I glanced down at the cup still sitting untouched in front of me, the faint steam now gone, the surface still. "And the tea?" I asked. "Where does that fit into this plan?" Neither of them spoke. Chloe looked away first. Daniel followed. That was answer enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the old wood creak beneath me, a familiar sound in an increasingly unfamiliar moment. "Do you remember," I said slowly, "the winter you broke your arm?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the shift. "What?" "You were 8, I continued. "You fell off your bike at the end of the driveway. It was snowing. You were more scared than hurt." He frowned, confusion replacing the panic in his expression. "Mom, what does that have to do with anything?" I folded my hands together again, resting them lightly on the table. "You would not let the doctor touch you," I said. "You kept saying it would hurt. You kept looking at me, waiting for me to tell you it would be okay." The memory hung between us, quiet but undeniable. "So I held your hand," I continued, my voice steady, even, "and I told you the truth. I told you it might hurt for a moment, but it was necessary. And you believed me." Daniel swallowed, his throat tightening as the connection began to form in his mind. Chloe watched him now, her own unease deepening as the conversation moved somewhere she could not control. "Trust," I said softly, "is a fragile thing. It is built slowly over years, and it can be broken in a single moment." The clock ticked again. Once. Twice. Chloe pressed her lips together, her earlier confidence now completely gone. "We were going to explain," she said quickly, the words rushing out as if speed could make them more convincing. "We just needed the right time." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw not just who she was but what she represented. Not the cause but the catalyst. "The right time," I repeated. "Is that what you call it?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once more, his movements restless, unsteady. "This is getting out of hand," he said, more to himself than to either of us. "We just need to focus on getting Chloe okay." I nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "You should." He froze at that, something in my tone stopping him mid-step. "What does that mean?" he asked again, but this time there was less anger, less accusation, more uncertainty. I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him feel it. "It means," I said quietly, "that whatever you thought was going to happen today did not." Chloe closed her eyes briefly, her breathing uneven, her hand gripping the edge of the table once more. Daniel looked between us, the pieces finally beginning to fall into place, though not in the way he had expected. And as I sat there, in the same kitchen where I had spent decades cooking meals, celebrating holidays and building a life around family, I realized something with absolute certainty. The woman they thought they could manage, the woman they thought would quietly accept whatever they decided for her, she no longer existed. And the one sitting in her place was not someone they had prepared for. Daniel stopped pacing, but the restlessness remained in the way his shoulders stayed tense, in the way his eyes refused to settle on one place for too long. Chloe's breathing had slowed slightly, but she still looked unsteady, her usual composure replaced by something far more fragile. I watched them both carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet distance that had taken me years to learn. "You should sit back," I said calmly to Chloe. "Take a moment." She hesitated, then followed the instruction without argument, lowering herself more fully into the chair, her hands resting loosely in her lap now, as if she had finally accepted that control was no longer hers. Daniel looked at me again, searching for something he could hold on to. "If you knew something was wrong," he said, his voice tighter now, "why did you not just say it?" I considered the question not because I needed time to answer, but because I wanted him to hear it properly. "Because," I said slowly, "sometimes people reveal more when you let them continue." He frowned, the meaning settling in piece by piece, each part harder to accept than the last. "We were not trying to hurt you," he said again, though the words sounded weaker this time, less certain, as if even he could hear the truth slipping through them. I glanced at the kitchen window, where the late afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the floor. "Intent," I said quietly, "does not erase outcome." Chloe let out a small breath, her eyes still closed for a moment before she opened them again, more focused now, more aware. "You think we planned something against you," she said, her voice steadier than before, though not by much. I turned my attention back to her. "I do not think," I replied. "I observed." That distinction seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. Daniel exhaled sharply, running his hands over his face as if trying to wipe away the situation entirely. "This is not how it was supposed to go," he muttered, almost under his breath. "Caught it anyway." "Of course I did." "No," I said. "It is not." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty, only the slow, undeniable weight of reality settling into place. Chloe shifted slightly, her posture more upright now, her strength returning in small increments. "If you believe that," she said carefully, "then what exactly do you think we were trying to do?" I met her gaze without hesitation, letting the question sit between us for a brief moment before answering. "You were trying to make a decision for me," I said. "Without me." Daniel looked up sharply. "That is not fair," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is it not?" He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, the argument dissolving before it could fully form. Chloe looked at him, then back at me, her expression shifting once more, this time into something more measured, more controlled. "We were thinking about your future," she said. "About what is best for you." I allowed a faint smile, one that did not quite reach my eyes. "No," I said. "You were thinking about convenience." The word hung in the air, simple but precise. Daniel took a step back, as if the space between us suddenly felt too small. That is not true, he insisted, but even he seemed unsure of it now. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table once more. You came into my home, I said, my voice steady even, with a plan that did not include me. You brought something you expected me to accept without question. And when I did not, I let the sentence trail off, leaving the conclusion unspoken but unmistakable. Chloe's lips pressed into a thin line, her earlier vulnerability now replaced by a guarded silence. Daniel looked between us again, caught in the space where certainty used to be. So what now? He asked finally, the question carrying more weight than he likely intended. I sat back again, the chair creaking softly beneath me, the sound familiar, grounding. Now, I said, we stop pretending. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to, because for the first time since they had walked through my door, everything was exactly as it appeared. No layers, no disguises, just truth, and it was heavier than anything they had planned. Daniel lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me, as if the weight of everything that had just been said had finally settled into his body. Chloe remained still, but there was a new awareness in her posture now, a careful stillness that suggested she was no longer reacting but thinking. That, more than anything, told me the moment had shifted. We are not pretending, Daniel said after a long pause, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. I tilted my head slightly. No. I asked. Then tell me, Daniel, when exactly were you planning to include me in your decision? He looked down at his hands clasped tightly together, the knuckles pale. We were going to talk to you, he said. Soon. I gave a small nod, acknowledging the word without accepting it. Soon, I repeated quietly. That is a very flexible word. Chloe finally spoke again, her voice measured, more controlled than before. You are making this into something it is not, she said. We were concerned about your well-being. That is all. I met her gaze evenly. Concern does not usually arrive with conditions, I replied. The silence that followed was sharper this time, less uncertain, more deliberate. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his eyes closing for just a moment as if he were trying to reset the situation in his mind. What do you want us to say? He asked, opening his eyes again. That we made a mistake? I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked at the table, at the 2 cups still sitting there, one untouched, the other no longer holding the same quiet certainty it had a few minutes ago. I want you to understand, I said finally, that this was never your decision to make. Chloe's lips pressed together, her composure tightening again. Families make decisions together, she said. That is how it works. I shook my head slightly. Families respect boundaries, I said. That is how it lasts. Daniel looked between us, his frustration returning, but this time it was quieter, more contained. We were trying to help you move forward, he said. You cannot stay here forever, Mom. Things change. I allowed a small pause, letting his words settle before responding. Yes, I said. They do. I lifted my gaze to meet his again. But change is not something you impose on someone else's life. It is something you choose for your own. Chloe shifted in her chair, her earlier unease now replaced by a sharper focus. And what if your choices are not the best ones? She asked. What if you are holding on to something that is no longer right for you? I studied her for a moment, considering not just the question, but the intent behind it. Then I live with the consequences, I said calmly. Not you. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, his movements slower now, more deliberate. This is not just about you, he said. It affects all of us. I gave a faint smile, one that carried more understanding than warmth. No, I said. It does not. He frowned, the statement clearly not aligning with whatever reasoning he had built in his mind. Of course it does, he insisted. We are your family. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking softly beneath me. Then act like it, I said. The words were not raised, not sharpened, but they landed with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Chloe looked away first, her gaze drifting toward the window, the fading light reflecting faintly in her eyes. Daniel remained still, His expression caught somewhere between defensiveness and realization. "We thought you would trust us," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. I held his gaze steadily. "I did," I replied. The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect him more than anything else I had said. His shoulders dropped slightly, the tension shifting into something heavier, something harder to ignore. "And now?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the man sitting in front of me, but the boy he had been, the years that had passed between then and now, the choices that had shaped him into someone I no longer fully recognized. "Now," I said quietly, "I pay attention." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was final. Because whatever uncertainty had existed before, whatever assumptions they had made about me, about what I would accept, about what I would overlook, had been replaced by something far more solid. Awareness. And once that is there, it does not leave. Daniel did not respond immediately after I said that. He just sat there, staring at the table as if the wood grain might offer him an answer he could not find anywhere else. Chloe, however, was already adjusting, already recalibrating in that quiet, deliberate way she had always done. I noticed it in the way her posture straightened again, in the way her breathing evened out, in the way her eyes sharpened just enough to suggest she had moved past reaction and into strategy. That shift did not surprise me. What surprised me was how clearly I could see it now. "So what happens next?" she asked, her voice calm again, almost composed, as if the moment from earlier had already been filed away and categorized. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I did not feel the need to soften my expression. "That depends," I said, "on whether you are ready to be honest." Daniel let out a quiet breath, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together once more. "We are being honest," he said, but the words sounded more like a request than a statement. I tilted my head slightly. "Then say it plainly," I replied. "No explanations. No justifications. Just the truth." The silence that followed was longer than any before it. Chloe glanced at Daniel, a brief, meaningful look, the kind that carries entire conversations without a single word. He saw it. I saw it. And in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Finally, Daniel spoke. "We thought it would be easier if you agreed to sell the house," he said, his voice steady but low. "If you moved somewhere smaller, closer to us." I nodded slowly. "And if I did not agree?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Chloe stepped in before he could answer. "We believed you would come around," she said carefully. "Given time." I held her gaze, unblinking. "And if I did not?" I repeated. This time, neither of them answered right away. Daniel looked away first. Chloe's composure held, but only just. "Then we would have needed to encourage the process," she said finally, choosing her words with precision. I let that sit in the air for a moment, letting the weight of it settle fully before I spoke again. "Encourage," I repeated softly. "That is an interesting word." Daniel shifted in his seat, discomfort now fully visible in the tension of his shoulders. "It is not what you think," he said quickly. "We were not trying to force anything." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "No," I asked. "Then what exactly was the purpose of the tea?" The question landed harder this time because there was no avoiding it, no reframing it, no softening it. Chloe's lips pressed together, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped again. Not completely, but enough. "It was supposed to help you relax," she said. I did not respond right away. Instead, I let my gaze drift briefly to the cup in front of me, still untouched, still holding whatever answer they had tried to hide. Then I looked back at her. "Relax enough to what?" I asked. The silence that followed was not just heavy. It was revealing. Daniel's jaw tightened. Chloe's eyes flickered again just for a second. And in that second I saw it. Not just the plan. Not just the intention. But the assumption behind it. They believed I would not question it. They believed I would accept it. They believed I would not notice. "You underestimated me," I said quietly. Daniel looked up sharply, the words hitting something deeper than the conversation itself. "That is not fair," he said, but his voice lacked strength. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "It is accurate." Chloe inhaled slowly, her composure returning piece by piece, but the earlier certainty was gone. "You are turning this into something extreme," she said. "We were trying to manage a difficult situation." I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking softly beneath me, grounding me in the moment. "No," I said again. "You were trying to control it." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if the distinction itself was too much to process. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than ever before. I looked at him for a long moment, measuring not just his words, but the space between them. "I want you to understand something," I said finally. "This is my life. Not a situation to manage. Not a problem to solve. And certainly not something you get to decide for me behind my back." Chloe did not respond. Daniel did not argue. And in that silence something shifted again. Not in them. In me. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to what was happening around me. I was defining it. And that changed everything. The room did not change, but the way it felt did. The walls were the same, the table was the same, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner had not shifted even slightly, and yet everything inside that space had been rearranged without a single object moving. Daniel leaned back slowly, as if he had finally run out of arguments, or perhaps run out of ways to avoid what was already clear. Chloe remained composed on the surface, but the stillness in her had changed. It was no longer controlled. It was measured, careful, like someone choosing each next move with more caution than before. I let the silence sit between us, not as a gap to be filled, but as something intentional, something earned. "You always thought I would not notice," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, without accusation. Daniel looked up, his expression tightening. "That is not true," he said quickly, but the speed of his response betrayed him. Chloe did not interrupt this time. She only watched. "You thought I would not question you," I continued, not raising my voice, not pressing harder, just stating what had already revealed itself. "That I would accept whatever you placed in front of me, because that is what I have always done." Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. Whatever he had planned to say did not survive the weight of what was already understood. "That is not who I am anymore," I added quietly. Chloe shifted slightly, her hands now resting flat on the table, her posture straight, composed, but no longer relaxed. "People change," she said, her tone even. "Situations change. Families have to adapt." I looked at her, holding her gaze long enough to make the point land without needing to sharpen it. "Adaptation requires honesty," I replied. "Not strategy." Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them, though the room was not cold. "We were trying to do what we thought was best," he said again. But this time it sounded less like a defense and more like something he was telling himself. I nodded once, acknowledging the sentence without agreeing to it. "That is often how people justify decisions that are not theirs to make," I said. Chloe's expression flickered just slightly, a small shift that might have gone unnoticed before. But I noticed everything now. "So what happens now?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time, more cautious, as if she understood that the answer mattered more than anything that had come before. I let my hands rest lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the moment. "Now," I said slowly, "we return everything to where it belongs." Daniel frowned, confusion crossing his face. "What does that mean?" he asked. I met his eyes directly. "It means you do not make decisions for me," I said. "You do not plan around me. And you do not assume that I will accept something simply because it is presented as care." Chloe did not respond. Daniel looked down again, the realization settling deeper now, no longer something he could push aside. "And the house?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter than before. "What about it?" I allowed a small pause before answering. "The house stays," I said, "because it is mine." The simplicity of the statement seemed to carry more weight than anything else I had said. There was no anger in it, no emotion pushed forward, just fact. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly against the table, a subtle reaction, but enough to show that the answer had not aligned with whatever expectation she had been holding on to. Daniel nodded slowly, as if absorbing something he had not fully prepared to hear. "And us?" he asked, his voice almost careful now. I looked at him for a long moment, longer than I had at any point during the conversation. Not searching. Not questioning. Just seeing him clearly. That depends, I said quietly, on what you do next. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of choice. For them. For me. For everything that would come after this moment. Chloe looked at Daniel, then back at me, her expression unreadable now, her earlier confidence replaced by something more uncertain. Daniel did not move. He did not speak. And for the first time since they had walked into my home, neither of them seemed to be in control of what came next. I let that settle. Because control, I realized, was never about raising your voice or forcing a decision. It was about knowing when to stop giving it away. And in that moment I had taken all of mine back. Daniel did not answer right away, and I did not expect him to. Some moments are not meant to be filled with quick words or easy explanations. Some moments require silence, the kind that forces a person to sit with what they have done and what it means. Chloe was the first to move. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that suggested she had already begun to think several steps ahead. She reached for her bag, placed neatly beside her chair, and stood up slowly, steady now, composed once more. Whatever had unsettled her earlier had passed, or perhaps it had simply been replaced by something stronger. Control in a different form. "We should go," she said softly, not looking at me but not avoiding me either. Daniel looked up at her, then back at me, as if waiting for some kind of permission that I had no intention of giving. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of certainty, stripped of defense. This is not how I wanted things to be." I held his gaze, not unkindly, but without softening the truth that had already settled between us. "It rarely is," I said. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if accepting something he could no longer argue against. Chloe stepped toward the door, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the wooden floor. Each step measured, each movement controlled. Daniel followed, but slower, his steps heavier, as if something in him was still trying to hold on to the version of this day that had not happened. At the doorway he paused. He turned back just slightly, enough to look at me one more time. There was something in his expression now that had not been there before. Not anger. Not even frustration. Something closer to uncertainty. "Will you be okay?" he asked. The question lingered in the air, simple on the surface but layered beneath. I considered it for a moment, not because I needed to think of an answer, but because I wanted to understand the question itself. "I have always been okay," I said quietly. He held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded again, this time more firmly, as if that answer, in its simplicity, had given him something he could take with him. Chloe opened the door without another word. The late afternoon light spilled in briefly, casting a pale glow across the floor, then faded again as they stepped outside. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. And just like that, the house was quiet again. But it was not the same quiet I had grown used to over the past few years. This was different. This was chosen. I remained seated at the table for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly against the surface, the faint imprint of the conversation still lingering in the space around me. The two cups were still there. One untouched. One no longer part of the plan it had once carried. I reached out slowly and slid them both toward the sink, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. The sound of porcelain against wood was soft, almost ordinary, but it marked the end of something that had been building far longer than this single afternoon. I stood up, my movement steady, and walked to the window. Outside, the street looked the same as it always did. A car passed by. A neighbor's dog barked faintly in the distance. Life, unchanged in its rhythm, continued without pause. But inside this house, something had shifted permanently. Not in the walls, not in the furniture, but in me. I no longer waited for approval. I no longer assumed good intentions where none were shown. And most importantly, I no longer confused silence with peace. I turned away from the window and walked back into the kitchen, the familiar space now carrying a different weight, not heavier but clearer. The kind of clarity that does not demand attention, but refuses to be ignored. Because once you see something for what it truly is, you cannot return to the version of it that existed before. And I did not intend to try.